The Strange Old Refuge, a story by Nikos. We lived in a pretty little cottage, our parents' cottage, our parents' place that they'd inherited from their parents, and they from theirs. For 7 generations, the cottage had borne our family name, had the crest above its doorway. The Smiths, or Smythes in earlier years, for hundreds of years, there had been generations recorded, living in and around that property, documented since the 1790s or thereabouts, when the great-great-great-great-grandfather, Silvio, himself, had travelled here all the way from Italy, from a line of Italian merchants, apparently, allegedly. And he took to the farmer's daughter too, to our 4 times great-grandmother. She was the connection to that great house, nearby, the large house, the landlord's home that had stood on the old farmland. From a long thatch that was way beyond our own vegetable patch of a garden, you could still hear the bird song and the hedges growing around them, all thick, wild and overgrown. There was still the old, long, gritty chalk path that ran through an overgrown field, full of wild flowers in spring to summer season. The path ran along to the old giant home, what was the store farmhouse long ago, with adjacent barns attached, but well dilapidated over the decades, would fall and collapse through beams, so no one trespassed through there. Before then arriving, the path would go on out to the outhouse barns, larger barns still intact though, large rectangular buildings, long ago boarded up now though, rotting through with some areas that were full of debris that had fallen over the years. Then to the left of the path, along further out, was a huge hedge, large thickets all grown into each other, giant and overgrown. And then further out to the right, over the long halls of the giant poppy fields, with a multitude of other flowers that seasoned up well in spring. Beyond those wild flowers, there were the gardens of the old farmhouse buildings themselves, with a whole variety of different bushes and flowers and even trees that had long since grown in a different permacultured way, still attended to by some of the other farm wives, though they didn't actually work in a functioning farm anymore. There were long luscious green lawns over there beyond the overgrown flower gardens, and beyond the smaller orchards. The green lawns that were enticing, and many strolling by, ramblers, those exploring the countryside, stopped to look by at them, take pictures, or to even smell the sweet fragrances. Encircling that was a giant looming fruit tree, a set of orchards, a long stretched out curvature row of them. In autumn you could smell the sweetness of all the fruits that were getting ready together. Back in the day, the farmhouse had been the landowner's farm in particular, though there were many other outbuildings, larger small pigsties and smaller animal buildings that they'd once been, many of those that were rotten through, that were really weathered thoroughly, too much to be any function now though, especially those that had been unsecured, unsheltered, that had no roof. The outbuildings were dotted here and there randomly throughout different fields that were often overgrown and no longer used, where the workers had once lived long ago. Some of the further out barns, that were mostly now dilapidated, collapsed in, unused now, except for birds that were nesting sometimes high up in the rooftop beams, where they were able to still fly in and flit out and about. Their homes had been smaller in the outbuildings far out. They had scarcer resources, but back in the day they had still been relatively homely all the same. They'd worked as hard labouring jobs, working through blistering hot summer suns and harsh winds of autumn too, and getting soaked in the early spring and late autumn season. Yet the land was a community of farm workers who'd lived there for some generations. Simple folk who'd visited for picking, gathering, and a variety of different works, maintenance work often on the farm, and helping the smiths themselves, the ironsmiths as these were. There were many different shacks nearby the old farmhouse still, but ones that no one really had entered for a long time. Neither had the landlord for a long time even. Other shacks that were really just storage facilities that no longer had anything of any use in them really. Rotting decayed rubbish from long ago. Plastics that were still in the container from long, long ago. No longer of use or of need to anyone. Other shacks that no one really had entered nor knew what was in them anymore. Old rusted storage maintenance tools mostly. Or they were just sort of full of thick cobwebs and had nothing really of any interest except for something historical, archaic, out of date, rusted and probably dilapidated even when it was in use many decades ago. So no one had entered those, the smaller outbuildings that were nearer by the farmhouse, not for a long time. Even when the last landlord's family and his own children had lived there, he'd only gone out to meet them sometimes, to meet the farm workers, met them over the fence, where his own property bordered theirs, often going out into the working fields, seeing them over the fence to give them instructions, where he'd visit them. Their attention was then taken with him when he was giving all the different complicated instructions. They had all the basic provisions need, so he didn't really need to discuss that with them. A fresh stream trickled by nearby. It was a small brook, but in dry season it's often disappeared though. Sometimes in the wetter season there'll be multiple brooks, tiny and small, but it would create a boggy kind of area, a boggy area to squelch through, though no one squelched that way often now. There it was often just a little brook, a few smaller brooks that often dried up, what was left of it. You could step over or smulch through it even in wet season now, though few ever did, few had reason to. When, back in the day, many had had to welly up or to mulch through, wading up to their knees sometimes in it all, when they'd gone out and shared the harvest, collecting it in themselves, in that area, when there'd been a need to do it. What was good for the farmer had also been good for the farm labourers too. They'd all prospered for those times, but long, long ago. Sylvia himself, the ancestor, had arrived long ago as a travelling freeman, but a trader and a worker, a man of multiple jobs. He did a variety of different labouring skills. He'd visited the farmer, travelling from a nearby neighbouring farm, when the work there had dried up, moving on as some of the other rovers had done too, with their labouring skills, going on to gather, to pick, to seed, to sow, to water, to weed, or to do a variety of the farm jobs. Sometimes it was maintenance works, thatching, or even just putting together some makeshift fencing around the old farmyards for the animals to fence them all in, binding and winding together, weaving the long strands of the different branches. Sometimes it was that he was doing, or hammering in old posts, bounding and winding leaves and different branches to create these makeshift fences, to fence in animals, to fence in stray animals from the neighbouring farms, really, since this farm was particularly more about vegetables that they were cultivating, growing, harvesting. That, and of course some of the nearby orchards too, that had developed only to a limited extent though. Silvio himself, a foreigner who'd arrived trading, travelling, trading his skills for his own abilities, trading the skills for his shelter and his lodging, but also for the food and a small share of the produce too, some of the fruit and the vegetables that he was able to eat himself. He'd been able to trade a variety of those skills for a variety of different food and drink, and also a share of some of the leaves. Arriving as a travelling salesman himself, visiting the farmer, he met him at the door of the farmhouse itself, quite formal, but in his muddy slacks all the time, in his old uniform, his labouring slack. Met him at the door and introduced himself, very politely, well spoken, even though they struggled at first to understand each other well. He was told, yes, he could pick fruit that was in season with the other pickers, and had gone out to join them for some weeks before moving on to other farms, but he later returned once more, several seasons running, to the same old farm, to do the same old fruit gathering in the orchards, and also stayed on for many more months, longer and longer as the years went on, extending his work stay and his placements so that he would pick longer, picking out vegetables, starting off and then going into the orchards for later on in the season, where he'd later on eventually work 8 or 9 months of the year, staying on to work there more full-time as a longer-term resident. And then the other 3 or 4 months of the year, he sometimes went to retire or to find other lodgings where he could do other kinds of work. There could be something else out of season, though those were rare that he was able to find that and hoped to sustain himself enough with the regular work at the orchard and vegetation farm that he was able to gather and fruit pick well for a good many seasons, as eventually he'd done. He'd met the ironsmith there, though, at the old court. The farm court was large, old and grey, with lots of grey bricks, and it was stacked high and a little crumbling and falling apart, even back in those days. It was often had to be cemented in, where there'd be little cracks that had broken up, crumbling away now and again, cementing in old cracks that formed both on the paths and the old buildings. It was also part of Silvio's job too, just helping out in maintenance work, sometimes an out of season. But it had not been a working active farm, not a commercial farm, not for a long time, not now. For over 30 years, in fact. The last farmer to own the property, long ago, had gone bankrupt a long time ago. They had decided I'd had to sell up. Not for a long time now then. Nobody had really moved in, and it hadn't worked as a working farm in a long time. Therefore, the area, the vegetation of land surrounding it, had all grown wild. To varying extents of wilderness that it had grown to, though. There was a large field neighbouring that had really grown thick and wild, like a forest itself, but it was a forest full of different vegetables, sometimes those that had survived, but also some of the other smaller bushes that had been planted by man. The herbal gardens themselves, the herbal bushes, had grown into large, thick bushes, large tangled bushes all growing into each other, that sometimes were accessible, were it not for the dozens of other trees that had grown thick and bushy, and the multiple new saplings, all grown into middle-aged mature trees, often surrounding the larger trees, or the large thick growth, the thicket of bushes, the tangle of grown into each other, so much that it created obstacles, that with all the thick ivy growing around it, and then all the thick tangle of the nettles themselves, and all the brambles that are draped over, crawling up and over and around all the thick bushes of the trees growing up in a crowd together. It made so many of the old vegetations just impassable, and it made therefore getting at the old overgrown gardens, the overgrown herb gardens, the overgrown orchards, near total inaccessible in some of the areas at least, where it had grown much wilder, and there was a free rein for the brambles to grow thickly over all of the different tangled trees, the thick branches that were all draped and covered in all the thick tangle of brambles and nettles. My grandfather had remembered the days, though, not so long ago perhaps in his day, that the fields were then full of people, fewer people than even the age and the generation before, but still there were a larger amount of the pickers, the growers, the foragers, and then at home in the courtyards, there being the ironsmiths there themselves, in their facilities, in their old, smelly, dirty old barns, where they'd be working away, and then other weavers, and then cooks and cleaners, maintenance workers too, and others that did a variety of jobs that would be there. The old family cart dog that would be there barking away sometimes too, as well as cats meowing in and out, lapping up their saucers of milk. And they were seen lurking about, scuttling in and out, chasing mice here and there, in the old farm courtyard. Grandfather had lots of tales of the old farm labourers, farm animals, the farm visitors, the farm maintenance workers, and the farm family that lived there too. Lots of stories from the older times, those that he still remembered. But always there had been people back in the day, in his earlier times, in his childhood, and even early adulthood too. Always times when there were people there, when it was a functional farm, when it had even been a farm and a working farm, before they had to grow and change into something else. Then within a generation or two, things had changed, and changed so much for the land, as well as the buildings, and the people that occupied them, or that didn't visit them sometimes. The farmer had replaced many of the workers gradually, as modern machinery had arrived. The possibilities of those had made it less important to have so many workers there. Feeling that he had to compete on a more industrial scale with many larger farms that had developed, and that therefore Less work had to be done by hand, the sowing and also the harvesting of the seeds, the tending to all the different plants during their gradual growth, and also as they later produced the fruits themselves and later wilted away. The looking after of them and the soil itself and tending to it was much less done by hand and by mind and much more by machine and by the operators themselves. Some on the farm had remained, a few of the labourers and the machine operators still as well, maintenance workers, the cooks, the cleaners, those caring for the animals that were kept on too, as well as the other people. But a skeleton crew, really, of the full staff that had been an earlier age, of the full working labouring staff, a shadow of its former earlier self. Most of the people had gone on, migrated and moved on to other jobs, to other farms, or to other work entirely, had gone on to larger towns, or to cities themselves, to find more work, to go where there was more prosperity, or more chance of living fruitfully, but in a different job, to lured on by the hope of other prospects, or of other money. And eventually, as it had happened to his earlier labouring workers, and so too to the landowner as well, who'd also left, he too was inevitably ejected too, leaving the work at least. For even the machinery, he could not compete with the huge organisations that had larger amounts of the machinery installed. The last landlord that the grandfather could remember had struggled with some of the debts, had to remortgage, borrowing ever larger amounts and taking more risks with it too, hoping that things eventually would improve, but they hadn't eventually, no, and they didn't. And some of the largest supermarkets, main purchasers from some of the farms, had lowered some of their offers, and he found it difficult to find the right amount sometimes, and to sell his very niche products. The crops had fallen in a few bad seasons too. There'd been a small mini drought for several years that he particularly struggled within. His daughter had gotten ill some time as well. They'd had family issues as well with his mother. And also the cows, they were contaminated at time by some disease that had spread, and there'd been a real issue with the livestock on a neighbouring farm. The few cows that he had kept for a time, they mostly had focused on the vegetation, on selling vegetable niche products, but also some organic orchards too, some fruit from there. The neighbouring farms were then owned and sold off to a larger dairy company, had used it for dairy farms. The company had bought most of the neighbouring land on one side of the farm to increase their livestock in the area. Cows that were mulling and chomping their way through the large grassy fields, and sometimes moved on, occasionally, in their meandering, as they migrated on, passing through the neighbouring farce of the green grass. But then there was the farmyard of the quarters on the other side, the other neighbouring side, where I'd lived in the other cottage, nearby the farmhouse, just further on from the larger house, where neither of those was sold as part of the deal, when most of the farm had been sold off. For some years, Reggie had stayed on, the ancestor that had worked there, now the ex-farmer that he'd become then, but he'd stayed on even after it was all sold, stayed on in the old farmhouse itself. He'd figure he'd retire with just the house, but he just wasn't himself after the farm work had gone. The life seemed to pour out from him. He seemed to be dilapidated and weary from life, as that had taken up so much of its time before then. After Reggio had later passed on, what some claimed was of a broken heart. Perhaps he was secretly happy, though, who knew, of losing his beloved farm and his beloved farm workers and companions that he cherished for that time, as much as he apparently complained about it also too, and its community that he'd lived and worked with. He'd secretly loved them, apparently. Then his eldest son, who'd supposedly inherited some of the area from him, had come down to clean up afterwards, to tidy and sort it all out. Reggio's possessions that were left behind in the sold farmhouse, no longer the farm, but still the house for some of the former workers. The house then was then up for sale, just within 3 weeks after Reggio had died and moved on, and it was then later sold some 6 months later, quite soon for that time, but not before some arguments had happened. The younger brother, Reggio's younger son, who'd later turned up, had actually broken into the building, allegedly, according to the old stories. Someone had overheard them arguing about their father's home. It's not right that we sell it, had said the younger one, protesting, and for a long time he'd even allegedly squatted in there, staying in there, without any real permission to, though. But the older brother had later had him evicted, providing that the court's documents were all shown as they were, showing that the father had actually left the older son, him, the entire amount of the property, and so the younger was legally ejected later on after some court appearances. Though he'd come to stay with me next door in many years later, in the neighbouring cottage that hadn't been sold on, was no part of any of that. He'd come to stay for a short while, though, with me and the parents, because I'd come out to see him sleeping in what was an old pigsty, a ramshackle of a building, with a part dilapidated in roof and part that hadn't been fully weathered and broken into, not by the weather itself, so that part that was fully stayed up and structured, that had held out the weather for some time, for a few decades at least. It was still not so damp, and there was still an area there where the walls hadn't broken and crumbled in fully, an area that he crawled into and rested into a small cramped area. A real ramshackle, fallen-in, degraded building, though, on part of it at least, with long, rusting tin roofs on one side, that had just about held out the water, though, for a long time. I felt sorry for the lad, though, seeing him there, young and confused and weary at the time, when I'd first been sent out there to see how he was by the parents. And he seemed a little edgy, paranoid, worried, not sure who I was, or who we were even, staying at the nearby cottage that he'd not gone to frequent, nor knew us therefore. And he'd been saying some very odd things to me that left me unsure about him. There are people watching in the woods. The watchers, he claimed. He'd said many times, telling me this, looking out wearily from the old ramshackle of a building, on the rubbly courtway, looking out past the wild thicket of overgrown bushes, beyond that, into the larger woods, with the neighbouring farm nearby just off to one side, where he gazed at his stare too. It's the dairy workers, I said, from the nearby farm. They come over from the nearby farm. They just wander and explore some of the meadows, the ones not so overgrown, you know. The wildwoods they don't go into, I don't think. No one can get in there, I'd said, trying to reassure him, as he stared out there into that wild growth of old woodlands, beyond the wild tangle of the meadows themselves. No, there's other things. There could be witches and wizards out there, plotting things down there. You never know, he said faintly, still staring out there, and with a distant, vague look about him that I couldn't really summarise. He claimed all kind of crazy things to me, though. Said there were strange, weird sounds that he heard out there. Though I tried to reassure him, those were most likely just strange animal sounds, and if he was new here, he just wasn't familiar with what those were. I didn't know those. But sure, once he got familiar with those, then he'd be okay and know what those were. No one really visited or went out there late at night, not that I knew of. My parents never knew of either. I tried to reassure him. Still he went on, babbling, talking in his strange, almost drunken way, though he didn't stagger in any way, though, nor slur his words particularly, going on to say that there were weird, strange sights as well, strange shadows that seemed to emerge at the dark, massive shadows beyond them, that seemed to flicker weird lights that came and went and disappeared, but did strange, synchronized movements, that seemed to flash messages at him late at night, accompanying the strange, crying out, weird, cackling calls, as he described them. No, I'd never heard or seen anything like that. No, my parents wouldn't either. I tried and asked them, but I'd never heard them describe anything of the sort, really. I tried to say to him reassuringly, but not reassured myself, really. Not sure, though, perhaps if he'd hallucinated, imagined it, or if it was really just something that he hadn't described or been able to perceive that well at the time. Yes, perhaps some animal thing out there, or maybe I suggested some of the dairy workers on their time off. They were just out there having frolicking fun, just having a shriek or a laugh, playing with torches, gadgets and that, mucking around with those long laser beams that they sometimes take out there. Those could be seen for miles around. Sure, it could be something like that, just having a laser fun kind of party or something late in the evening. I don't know. I'd suggested it all to him vaguely, unsure myself if there would be those mucking around with torches, shrieking around. Perhaps, but in such a place as that you'd want torches. And maybe they were strong and could be seen at such distance. Maybe they were flicking them on and off just to see if they worked, or just Larking about, I'd suggested to him. I didn't even know the fellow that well. I'd heard about him. My father kept telling us about him a number of times, but had told us to stay away from the farmhouse, not to get involved in all the disputes, the arguments between the brothers, not to get tangled up with it all, really. That farmhouse had been nothing to do with the actual cottage nearby, not for a long, long time, though we were really nothing to do with it all, really. We'd always been taught that in our family, anyway, that it was nothing and no connection to us, and not to worry about it too much. Now, though, the house was no more. It was sold on then, but yet it hadn't been occupied or actually bought by any new strangers, so it was still awaiting to be renovated before it would actually be sold. I could see why the young chap was perhaps upset about it all, given the situation, but it perhaps had all got too much. I couldn't sleep or think for him too much, talking a bit insipidly about one conspiracy that he had, about his brother and what had happened, about whether the father's will was genuine or not, and whether it was really something that it could be proven and he wasn't sure of, and what all the strange calls and sounds that he'd heard and seen allegedly were. Then he was pacing the old halls, what was the courtyard, the rubble of different bricks strewn around, with dried up bags of cement to weave around, and rusting old machinery that slumped and rusted in the years, making odd comments here and there that left me baffled because I was following and struggling to keep up with him, really. So I only caught snippets of half-spoken sentences that I had to piece together, and he was elusive in his answers. Even when he repeated things, he seemed to say something different than perhaps he'd said before each time. One day the police were due to come over to visit the whole property. They were due to come over and do an interview with the man, apparently. The night before he'd actually broken into the house. That's what we'd been told, at least. Perhaps the brother had called them out of concern for why he was there, and that he'd been trespassing, technically, on his property that he'd inherited from the father. The new owner, though, had bought it, and then, understandably, perhaps, was upset to know somebody else, the old owner's son, that had sold it to him, was still staying on there, was trespassing and squatting in one of the old dilapidated outbuildings. Though the old house itself was sealed up for now, though, and he hadn't yet occupied that. But they understandably were upset and concerned that he was staying there, perhaps, so they'd gone to interview him to see why he was there and what was going on, though we didn't know the results of any of the interviews. We just heard about it too, perhaps, from someone that had seen them nearby there, one of the old farm workers that did still visit the cottage sometimes. But I think I got a shock. It was a shock visiting him and seeing him in that corner of the old dilapidated building that was large enough to wind round a large space, and that had some part of the inner wall still intact, not crumbled through completely, so that in that little corner, the old pigsty of a building, the old ramshackle part collapsed through, going in that particular corner, winding round and inside, it was really near pitch black in that little area where he crawled up in his old dirty blanket to sleep, and had some clothes and some bags in an area that wasn't too dusty, full of broken glass, cement, dust, dirt, and all sorts of broken bricks, all swept to one side, with a cleared space with his bags, just to one side of a dirty sleeping bag. How long had it been called up there? I said once my eyes had adjusted to it. But before the police had gone there to visit, some weeks ago, before we'd actually heard about it even, then I would have to go there and visit. I went there and visited before sometimes when the mother had sent me, but I didn't go in there. I hadn't gone in to actually inquire or to visit, just to look around at the outside. Hadn't really wanted to go in at that point. We hadn't felt any need to, because we hadn't known about any of the concern over it yet. Then I was told perhaps to go in further, and just to find out who he was myself, as we knew nothing of the interviews that several others had allegedly done. A few others that said they had talked to him and seen him briefly in person, but left conflicting reports about who or what he looked like or was. Well, I will return. I will return when the curse is lifted, and when the lie is exposed, he'd said suddenly, staring blankly at me later on, although I hadn't asked him that much about it. I'd only said, after he'd said that he was going to leave at some point, because there was no need to carry on, I'd said, well, would you return, or are you leaving for good? wondering if he meant that he was just leaving just for the day to have a look round the areas that he was staring out at, to explore those areas that he seemed mystified with nearby, as it seemed to be, but I wasn't sure by his words, being quite vague, what they really meant. Trying to clarify them, I'd asked, but again been mystified by his response. "I don't know, what lies do you mean?" I'd asked. I'd asked that, but he didn't answer, though, and stared back to the old farmhouse, the old house that was now sold on to the unknown neighbours, staring at the closed and locked front doors. But then he grabbed the little bag that he had, that he dropped by the side for some time, during his long stare as a statue, and then he sprinted out and along the courtyard, tripping over the rubble, but continuing his stumble. But he hadn't yet returned to this day, staggering off at that point, and I had not seen him since then. It was a surprise that nobody had moved into the farmyard perhaps before then. No one had moved into the old farmhouse for a long time after that even. That seemed a surprise, for some time past. It remained boarded up for a long time, in actual fact for a few years. It seemed a shame that it remained for Reggie's youngest, a place not to visit or not to know. Many years later there were some rumours. I'd heard that he'd been in trouble, and there'd been some alleged incidents that we'd read about that he'd done recently, locally. We heard that he'd got in trouble and had been sectioned in a mental health ward, had suffering from some mental disorder or something. Though that was many years ago, quite a long time ago. One of the ladies from the nearby hamlet of buildings, from what was a village nearby, down the road, about a mile's walk, had saw him visiting from a nearby hospital, once he'd been released some time ago. Well, it would have been better if he'd lived there, perhaps if nobody had stayed on there, and it was never later occupied. My mother had later said that, stating she felt sorry for him, but the father hadn't been sure, had given a long moody glance back to him, unsure how to respond. At that time, perhaps the repairs were too much, the maintenance costs, and all the groundwork that would need to be done, perhaps it was just too much to do. The new owners had never materialised, though, even some years on. At that time, I still had both parents, that they were living in the cottage together. We were there pretty much, though, as a stranded upland place, stranded far beyond the dozens of different scattered hamlets that made up the local village, some mile away. Still, it was a scattered little island, of mostly unoccupied buildings. A few were occupied, the ones further away, though, from the house, by visitors or travellers, or it was the occasional odd lost rambler that sometimes stayed there, but never for very long, really. People would appear rambling by, just seeking directions, but never staying for that long, merely to look around the place, really. Only a few ever stayed on to rest or pitch up for a night, never for a long time. Then one morning, it was a beautiful sunny morning, the birds were full of songs, it was a lovely colourful morning, full of life, but we'd heard a girl outside in the old farm courtyard, in the courtyard where she was outside, singing what appeared a beautiful song. It was hard to find her for a while. Finally, there I could track down the song to the orchard gardens. My parents' instructions, they bade me to go out there, to find her song, to see her, to who was singing this beautiful song they'd wondered, that could be heard quarter of a mile away, upstream. I watched her singing as I finally found her, on the edge of the wild tangle of meadow. The instructions they gave me was to find out who she was. An angel poolside, floating around the nearby trees, they were draped in the bright cloths that she'd woven down, hanging them up, the long cloths draped, hanging off the branches nearby her, that she was perhaps drying off some clothes, I fathomed, staring up to the branches beyond her. A tune echoing gaily in the branches. For some distance away I watched in awe, in love at the song and the sound of the lovely notes that she was singing. Oh no, her name was later Evelyn, as she'd introduced herself to at least, once she'd finished the long, harmonious song, and it felt right then to approach her and talk to her. As I gradually did, then I introduced myself. She said she was a travelling worker, from the nearby dairy farms. She worked at the dairy farms in season with her own partner too, for some months while they'd been there in season. They just left the dairy farm nearby. She sounded a little hacked off about it, upset about something. Said a couple of the labourers were sexist jerks or something. Said that with an anger, though briefly. She got okay afterwards, that. She said one of them had tried it on with her or something, and the other one had stood by and laughed as if it was some joke or something. But it happened a couple of times. A few too many times for her, and the partner, she felt, if he'd found out, would get more angry, and she'd not wanted to tell him, but felt bad. And they had been eyeing her up a long time and began putting their hands on her, but just as a joke, pushing them around. Their filthy hands, she'd spat out saying it still now with some unbridled anger, as if she hadn't said it before, or been able to. She shuddered at saying it and recalling it all, stepping back a little, even closing her eyes when she described the numerous incidents that had allegedly happened. As if she were now reimagining or reliving it a couple of times, she'd grimaced, but then had pulled herself back together before going on to describe the general conditions. The farm itself was okay, and most of the other workers, the labouring farmers, they were okay too. It was just a couple of them that she'd had some issues with. And then when she stayed with her partner, when he was back with her, more close with her again, things were okay when they were lodging closely together again, sleeping together again, and when they worked and the gathering together and the milking together okay, then she was all right. Had they hurt you, like in any serious way? I finally asked, thinking it over, a little concerned for her, wondering why she told me so frankly an open option. I'd asked this, wondering if she'd been attacked or if it was something more serious, given that she'd been quite angry and appeared a little upset during the recalling of it. But to the question, she turned her face aside. It looked like perhaps a tear in her eye, but she smudged it away, the look of sadness. I just felt belittled by them, she said after a long pause, as if considering what to really say. I don't know. I didn't know how to react. I felt a little scared how far it would go, she finally said. I had to leave there, that's all. Before the work, there was still a lot of work we could have done, but I felt I wanted to leave. I felt like giving them a whack before leaving, really. I don't know. I didn't know if they were violent or what they would do. I didn't know. I didn't want to, she finally said. Better just to leave, really, she said. Now we're without anywhere to stay, though. That's the problem, she went on finally to say, looking over now to some of the outbuildings in the old courtyard. And then, even beyond that, some of the more well-groomed hedges and the bushes, and our cottage beyond that, snuggling, but its only rooftop just barely visible, lurking up from the bigger bushes that surrounded it. There's just nowhere to stay, that's the main issue now, though. But yeah, I just felt we had to leave, really. It didn't get that bad, but I was worried it could have done, though. Finally, she had said to me, in a serious tone, and I nodded that yes, perhaps it was better under those conditions, if she wasn't sure where it had gone to. Perhaps better that she had left at that time. Don't know where to go now, or what to do with it, she finally shrieked, almost bursting into tears, though, sitting down and slumping to one side on an old wooden stump of a midsection cut out from a tree trunk, a couple of those that had been placed nearby each other, that old people had sat down on long ago, ramblers passing by, perhaps. She perched awkwardly on one of those, appearing to slump down, and making some groaning, moaning signs, appearing to heave her nose and eyes, as if snorting a little bit. And I fumbled to find a tissue or something in my pockets, seeing that they were empty, and I had nothing to give her, though. I stared down at her, unsure what to do or to say. I'm sorry for you. I hope you find somewhere or something, in time, maybe, I tried saying to her, sympathetically. Sorry, she said, finally, appearing to pull herself together, giving a loud snort and wiping her eyes and nose with the sleeve of herself, appearing not to have a tissue either. I'm sorry, she said, after a while, snivelling a little more. Don't be worried, it's okay. No, I'm all right. I helped her up to stand up, stumbling up to her feet again, though. She wavered a little unbalanced, though, appearing to be a little moved and upset by it. I think it best to try and help her a little in some ways, feeling unsure what position she was in. and then feeling it's perhaps useful to bring her back to the cottage because she stumbled along, tripping over a few of the smaller stones, not able to see where she was going or focusing on it, snivelling and snorting. She really seemed to be stumbling in her words too, and I offered to pick up and carry some of her bags with her, since she was slipping around and stumbling a little, even though the pathway wasn't that much rocky anyway, although there were a lot of stumbling rocks around. But I took her back to the old cottage, to Smythe Cottage, where I sat her inside there, because she seemed to be cold and shivering as well. When Mother was in there, and Mother had sat down opposite her, alongside the fireplace, with the young mysterious travelling girl, her face glowing up alongside the fireplace. So round that fire, the travelling mysterious girl had told her story. She said she'd been raised in an old children's home, long ago, yet had settled there. She then ran away in an adolescent age, many years later, because there had been some bullying there, a few she'd not got on with, and she was unhappy about it, unable to know what to do about it. She just left and ran away so far she hadn't known where she was going even. She'd managed to track down her mother, her own biological mother, but not knowing what kind of condition she was in, what state, from the brief snatched telephone conversations that she'd been able to have with her quietly. She'd feared that she was in a mental, unwell state to really care for her, or to put her up, or to support her well, not being able to fathom or decipher how mentally well her mother really was, from those brief conversations. Not being fully looked after so well, she had stayed on there though, so she'd lived with her own biological mother, with some serious illnesses and conditions that she didn't understand well. Was in fact a mother to her. However much she tried to be, she was never quite fully motherly. It was somehow not instinctual with her though she did try, it was a real struggle for her. She'd never taught her anything real important or that mature since adolescence though. In fact, she'd been more her mother's carer herself, until she'd become too ill for her to really care in any significant way for the mother, without fully knowing what she'd done or what conditions she really had, because it was a brief stay. She'd then gone into a care home herself to be cared for by others, and the girl was actually homeless technically for a while, even though she'd stayed at a variety of different care homes, moving then for a few years between a whole variety, a conveyor belt of different care homes that she'd moved through, having casual, brief relationships with all of the different caretakers, the guardians, that she didn't get to know that well. But there were lots of them, even though she got on with a lot of them quite well, and had a few issues with a lot of them as well. But she never became that familiar or got to know any of them that well, because they were only ever brief visits and stays, and care times for a few hours. They had to try and get to know her in as much a way, but never become familiar with her. So they were more acquaintance care homes, the long conveyor belt of those that she'd gone through for those years. So she didn't really feel that comfortable in knowing any of those, really, and had run away again. And then, after a rough period, a rough patch of having a few homeless nights on the streets, for many months in fact, that had lasted a long age, staying in a whole variety of sheds, old barns, different buildings, even staying in allotment small buildings too, tiny sheds that she could only stay in for a night or so, those that weren't locked up or secured well. She hooked up with a younger guy that she'd met. He was homeless, a rough sleeper too, that she grew to stay with for a while during that time, when they were both then rough sleepers. Only for a few months. She'd stayed with him for a month or two, where she'd lived and squatted with him in a rough patch of the life. But then he was developing in a more aggressive, a violent and controlling way for a time, and so she'd had to run away then from him, and then find other places separate from him, in a separate part of the town from him, discovering other buildings that could stay in, new builds that she stayed in, that could easily be gone in and out of, that had no doors and no windows either, so you could easily go in and out of, though it was quite vulnerable to the cold winds, and you could have to sleep in one part of the building. The new buildings and the very old few unsecured dilapidated buildings, ones that she found occasionally. She went back to squatting alone then, rather than partnering with the rough sleeper. During the time, she had a very kind, considerate way of putting across her story, telling it carefully to us. Me and Mother had listened to her alongside the fireplace, watching her eyes lit up as she described the sad and the strange situations. She was softly spoken too. Evelyn's charms and curiosities, as elegant and poised as she was sometimes, at least it was seemingly to be required to, especially for one that was going through a rough travelling patch. She seemed to be so calm and quiet, elegant even, in the way that she was sat there quietly poised, almost calm and attentive to us, looking up to us to make sure that we were listening, that we nodded along, stopping every so often to give us a more complete picture, to use a more accurate way of describing things if we appeared to be straining, to be frowning and flummoxed a little by what she was saying. At least when it was required, she seemed quite charming and quite attentive in her needs to the audience, to me and Mother that were listening to her. She spoke in a louder volume when Mum seemed to be straining more, and a calmer, slower pace as well, pronouncing each of the words more carefully. She was very softly spoken for most of it, really, and tried to restrain the emotion, though clearly she seemed to be struggling, clearly seemed to be quite upset and sad when describing some of the sadder parts of the story that was quite long and took some time for her to more fully explain it to us. Then she thrusted into the story describing her travelling roughly through the neighbouring towns. Dad had come in overhearing the last part of it, a little stern, albeit he seemed quite sensible in his ways though, but often took a more cynical approach, whereas me and Mother could often be more naive, perhaps. "So you're homeless," he said, after listening to the tail end of the conversations, to a good part of it though. He'd asked her this gruffly, coming in with mud and gruff down him. "Looking up for a place to stay then, I guess?" he'd asked, eyeing her up, sitting himself down, joining the three of us, sat on the chairs that were all edged in close around the fireplace. Then he edged up close to us, examining the three glowing faces, looking over to the strange face glowing too, of Evelyn, the narrator, having given us the story, and him the just last few chapters. Come over to join Evelyn and Mum closely, standing by them and scrutinising them closely, sitting closer to the fire and stocking it up himself with new logs that he threw on top carefully. Having then listened carefully to her replies quietly from afar, that she'd given out more quietly now to him, she then looked over to Dad, to his eyes. "It's okay, sir. I'm not imposing on you. I don't intend to. I wasn't asking you. I didn't have any expectations," she'd said finally, after a long time. "I have an apartment elsewhere. I came here because I was alone and upset. After working, at the neighbouring farm, with my partner," she'd finally said in her answer. But Dad hadn't really looked entirely convinced by the answer. "You're sure?" he said after a while. "My son can take you to a hospital or something. There's a local hostel in town. They're reasonably cheap. It's quite affordable. You could go to the hostel, stay there until you find somewhere else, perhaps," suggested Dad. "There is one in town. It's not that far. I could give you a lift even. One of us could," he suggested, then looking over to Mum, alluringly, taking command of the situation, then looking over to me, encouragingly. "No," she said, waving her hand aside. "I'm covered. It's okay, thanks. Thanks all the same, though," she said, nodding along politely, but curtly, looking then away from Dad, who looked sullen, and sulked away quietly for a time, turning away now, as if to think about it more. Mum looked her over more closely, though, still studying her, still a little surprised at the new arrival in our lives that Evelyn was. Evelyn then turned in her chair, turned towards Mother, saying, "You have a really lovely house. It's very quaint, very lovely," she said to Mother, pleasantly. "Do you live locally? I mean, are you from local?" Then Mother had inquired, looking over uncertain. No, I wasn't originally. I worked local just for the last few months. For the year or so I arrived here because I had friends that lived here, she said. But now I do, I suppose. Well, I'm living here now, Evelyn said with half a laugh and a smile, though Mum looked a little confused at the answers that she tried to confide with her. Yeah, so I just moved here, really. A few months ago, I met friends that were working here. So I moved here to work with them while there was work, but I had to leave because there was trouble there, people that were abusive, but I couldn't actually report it, like I told you. Evelyn then had said more seriously now. So, yeah, I tracked down the name from a neighbouring farmer of my mother's, she then had said, remembering him visiting from before I was born. Well, we all listened to a new part of the story intently. That's the real reason that I travelled here to work, because I wanted to be near here, really, because of what I'd heard and read about it, actually. So that's why I moved here. I met the friends here because I was looking for work here. Um, I met them online. You know, it was through a site they were looking for other workers. And I talked to other people that had worked in the area. They told me it was an all right farm to work to, and it would only be a few miles from here, well, where I wanted to be and visit, really. And I tracked the name down, like I said, from a neighbour. Oh, it was a neighbour of mother's. She remembered him before actually visiting, before I was born, a long, long time ago, repeated Evelyn, trying to clarify. There'd been a really long pause, as if she'd be considering whether to give this part of the story to us or not, whether to trust us or not. We all listened intently to this finally, to what this now meant. That's why I'd really travelled here, to find out more about the area around where I'd worked. That's why I was working there. I could have found work in any place, but I chose to do this because they said my father, long ago, had lived here. And, well, I came to find out more about him and who he was. And that's it, really. I knew nothing about my father, and Mum just told me something about him. This was where he happened to work a long time ago. He lived here a long time. He worked here a long time. So I wanted to find out about him because, Mum said he was from here, he worked here. She'd finally confessed. Her green eyes, still flickering, sparkling with the fire, now turned fully to us and staring at her. She was staring over at us. Dad looked over to her a little amazed now, in awe at the story, looking back a little incredulous about it now. What you talking about? Here, asked Dad. Not here in the cottage here. You mean like the neighbouring farm, the farmhouse next door or something? Dad had said, trying to clarify. She looked a little confused about it. He was almost looking totally amazed, perplexed, half a smile and half a horror on his face to contemplate it all. Evelyn stared back at him across the actual lounge, him also staring, his eyes flickering in the fireplace too. She'd also looked a little confused too. Oh, what, there's the neighbouring farmhouse as well? Asked Evelyn, trying to clarify. I just got told he was from Smythe Farm, that he lived and worked at Smythe Farm. That's what Mum had said. Is this Smythe Farm then, is it? She then asked Dad, and then flicking a look over to Mum as well. No, 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 clarified Mum. No, this is just the Smythe cottage. Smythe Farm's next door, so it's a completely separate building, Mum now said, clarifying. You said that your father was here on Smythe Farm, or Five Cottage, then father had asked directly, trying to then further clarify. Yeah, it was Smythe Farm, finally she had said, and both Mum and Dad had looked over. Now Dad's smiling and laughing a little even, knowing that that made more sense at least. Yes, she said, it was Smythe Farm, that's what Mum had said. That's where he'd worked, I think, and lived there too. Well, a long time ago, she said. Yes, finally she'd nodded and confirmed that he had. Dad then had looked up, a little deranged, but reassured now from that. Ah, well, then I'm glad to know that I'm not your grandfather or anything, because my father had lived from before that. I thought you meant him or his brother, my uncle. No, of course, you're talking about Smythe Farm. I don't know so much about. A lot of different people lived there back in the day. A lot of people, because it was such a large place. You could see it from the outside. It's all been sealed up a long time ago. No one's lived there in a long time, though, Dad had said finally, after a while. No, I didn't mean here. Sorry about that, Evelyn had said. No, he lived up at the big house at the farm then, I guess. I didn't know that this wasn't it, though. I hadn't been around the place that much. No, my father was born. They said he was buried here, too. Then trailed off Evelyn, looking a little melancholic, sad about this. His name was Reggio, she said finally. This had explained all the confusion. Dad had apologized for appearing a little perplexed earlier at her. And then we all sat around the fire, then talking and eating, talking with Evelyn. And we told her a little about her father, from the stories that we heard about Reggio and some of the other workers that had lived up at the big farmhouse, at old Smythe House. Those stories about Reggio that our father had heard about him and the other workers, and two of Reggio's brothers also, that had lived up at the big house, Smythe farmhouse, telling her all about Reggio and the two brothers. We didn't have their contact details though, Dad said. Hadn't known Reggio's older brothers or younger son that he thought he perhaps had that had moved on long ago. No, didn't have any contact details for anyone, he was sorry to announce, and saying to her he was sorry about that, but knew nothing about where any of the people there had moved to or where any of them their contact details were. He knew nothing, he was sorry to say. Then it was a very late hour to be at, very late, and Evelyn announced, looking then at the time, that she'd have to go off. She would be off soon. She would have to go and look for home. All had wondered if she really had even a place to go to. Mother had asked if she'd stay on. Perhaps she'd want to stay on the couch or something. But no, she'd declined and said that she'd go out and she'd be okay. She was going out for the dark, windy rain and walking miles from town. But I'd asked her if she wanted a lift. But thrice times she'd refused, though. Well, this is ridiculous, said Dad, feeling sorry to see her going out, to getting soaking wet into the dark rain as well, stumbling down the long dark corridors out in the countryside. I came in from the doorway. It's okay. I'm going to be okay out there. It's your fault, the mother was saying to Dad. You made her feel unwelcome. She's miles from anywhere, on her own, looking for a father. Well, looking to learn about your father, aren't you? What if something happens to her? And there were those lads at the factory, the farm, treated her badly. No, you should be allowed to stay here. Just for the evening, you'll be okay, Mother had implored. Well, Father had said after long contemplation, she's the one who's insisting on leaving. I mean, we can only offer, can't we? I offered for her to be given a lift, into the hostel in town. You'd be perfectly all right there. We'll even pay for it yourself until you find somewhere else to go on to. Go back to your own place that you've got, because you could be able to get back there tomorrow morning, okay, the father had said. We'll help you get to the hostel in town. We'll even call them for you, he'd suggested, though. But then Mother had said no, it was far too late to do that. They wouldn't accept anyone at that ridiculously late hour anyway. It was far too late now, she'd said. And that then appeared to stop that suggestion going anywhere. Evelyn had already gone and left, though, saying that she didn't want to stay on at the house with us. She'd left, scuttling off into the dark, into the cold, and into the wet. But it had taken some time later, of Mum going on and on at Dad and saying, what if something had happened to that poor girl going out there, that she'd fallen over, by accident, down in one of those long, dark corridors, in one of those unfrequented lanes, in a country lane where she wouldn't be discovered until the morning with her serious injuries. Any number of things could happen out there, went on and on, Mother at him. Finally he caved in and sent me scuttling out after her, chasing down the dark corridor with a torch, crying out a strange call to her as I scuttled down the dark corridor. I scuttled and ran, scrambling down the corridor, running up beyond the farmhouse itself. Yet I could not see her any more from there. Yet wearily soaked myself to the bone, soaked thoroughly through, I wearily stumbled back to the cottage itself, to Smythe Cottage, to find my parents inside there, inside the insulated home, staring out the dark door into the unknown world and mystery, waiting for my appearance back at the door, eagerly anticipating me stood together at the door. "Any sign of her?" said mother, concerned, stood there, staring out at me, as I approached, soaking wet, muddy, stumbling into the doorway. Shook my head, giving her the answer. Then we all went back to the fireplace, a big blanket wrapped around me by mother, as I dried myself close to it, with towels given chucked over to me by father, as I then roughly dried myself off, changing to the dry clothes once more. Except it had gotten lower now, the fire, and was just much smaller than it had been earlier. None of us really had the heart to rebuild it, to stack it back up again now. Sat there for some time now, staring up out at the window. We stared at the dark windows now and again, as the fierce rains pelted, rattled against the old window panes. Mum, staring out every now and again after she'd made tea for us, was telling about the earlier jobs, the chat to her sister, and all the different maintenance works, the plans that were going on, and telling us all different stories, but every now and again stopping as the fierce rains rattled once more on the window pane outside, and each of us stared out there, wondering. Mum finally went out to one of the windows, staring out and looking out to the dark, shadowy world outside. Looking out sadly an hour later, several times she wandered off and stared out dark windows, appearing to squint and strain her eyes to really stare out at what appeared to be strange shadow moving, or really strange lights somewhere beyond. She stared out several times, before finally, some hours later, retiring to bed. Dad was unconsciously solemn, staring out, sat slumped like a statue, staring at the same sentence and paragraph of his newspaper for a long time that he liked to read for an hour or two, musing by the fireplace as it gradually cooled. Still, slumped as a statue, steeped in thought for a long time, stumped by some paragraph that he would never tell anyone about. Finally, though, after a long time, he said that we both have to go out in the morning, have a look for her when it's finally light again and dried up enough. We'd have a look, and she'd probably be all right, he reassured me, half-heartedly. But then he too, after Mum had gone and retired up to bed. I was unconvinced by it, though, still a little worried for the girl. How genuine she was, I wasn't sure if she was really going to be okay or not. Concerned for the girl's safety, I was considering ringing up the police or to report a missing person, but I wasn't sure what to do or who to report it to. With both the parents upstairs asleep, I didn't know if I should perhaps report it to someone or who to. And then I happened to glance out at one of the dark windows myself. The rain had ceased to become falling in heavy motion now, and it was lighter rain that fell, and didn't shake any of the window panels any more. I stared out suddenly to see the large shadowy monolith of the farmhouse far beyond, but then seeing some sort of ghostly light, some flicker of lights, unfamiliar to my sight before, in one of the windows. It was a kind of square flickering, several square flickering lights in a small area, out in a dark patch. She must be in there, with a candlelight that was lighting up a little rectangular or square window, a couple of them perhaps. I finally fathomed, deciphering the small square lights flickering in one corner of the dark patch that I was seeing. Took me some time to decipher that's probably what it was, seeing where it was located in the bigger dark picture. I knew Evelyn was probably safe then. Yes, she must have gone to one of the old court buildings in that area of the dark patch that I took some time to stare out to before I could probably know. She probably was safe in there then. If the flickering lights were there were only a couple of them, since that building in that kind of area did have a couple of windows, yes. So she must have broken into it, clambered in, probably, through one of the old, dilapidated, fallen-in tin roofs that had rusted up over the years, that could have been peeled back and clambered into with ease. Probably inside, taking shelter in there then, I reasoned. But she probably made it into a temporary home, just to squat in for the night, I guess. But that night, having been reassured of that, at least, still I didn't think it was right to go out there. If she was sleeping in there, she could be disturbed to find me going in there, creeping in slowly up on her. And I think no one else ever visited that area. I never saw any ramblers there late at night. Never. Never beyond twilight. Nor before the dawn did anyone ever visit those abandoned old courtyard areas. No, they were so tangled and overgrown, with rough, old rocky debris or fallen in materials. There was nothing interesting to see there, and lots of cobwebs to bash around and remove out of your hair. No, there was nothing that you'd want to go and do there for in the evening. So I felt she'd probably be alone and relatively safe there, and I could shock her, scare her, if I happened to stumble in there while she was sleeping peacefully, and going in there, creeping up, and even giving her awake could give her an awful shock, perhaps. Even if I called out some awful strange cry, interrupting a peaceful dream of hers or something, it could startle her in some way, and I shouldn't want to do any of that. Not if she was most likely just sleeping peacefully in one of the old outbuildings, ill frequented late at night, certainly in the evenings. So I felt mostly reassured, rationalising all that over, as I'd stared out and making sense now of the situation, as I thought it probably was. I felt sure that she would need our help eventually, if she stayed on there, but I could go out in the early morning, before Dad was up, go out at the crack of dawn, in the early dawn, go out at first light, find out where that light source was, and just then call out. At least then, when she had a shock to hear my strange call in the morning, it would still be light then, and she would be able more easily to adjust to things. I felt sure perhaps tomorrow she might need our help more, that perhaps if she was just resting out there and didn't need us, if she was out there with candles, and could probably sensibly just rest up and just be okay lying down on the floor there, or find a little space to cuddle up in. I'm sure she would be alright because she had her bags, her change of clothes, and a little food on her. And when she'd left us, she'd gone out, it was still fairly dry, albeit cold at the time, but she had her clothes and a little blanket with her. Sure, she'd wrap up, snuggle up, and be cuddled up in the small cramped area, a little dirty, dingy and dungy. Once she pushed the cobwebs aside and found a little space, she said she was quite accomplished at doing all the squatting over some months. So I reasoned that she'd probably be okay, strewn on the dirty, cold, cobwebbed floors once she cleaned it up, and she probably had her time to, especially if she did have her candles as well, as she appeared to, from the strange flickering lights, visioned off in the dark patch of lands that I'd stared out into for some time. Sure, there was probably she would be okay. I didn't want to go out then, not in the night, not to spook her at a late time, and cry out, "Evelyn, Evelyn! Are you there, Evelyn? Are you okay?" No, I didn't want to call her out, not to disturb her during her sleep, if she was resting out there, nor to call attention to any others that could be nearby. No, not to wake Mum and Dad either and interrupt them in their sleep. They'd long ago fallen asleep also. I'd listened quietly, and heard footsteps then coming to me, and then a face appearing at the window of Smythe's cottage, eventually, that startled me. And unbeknownst to me, it was me that then got the shock, being sat there, at the embers then of the fireplace, that gave off very little heat, that was simmering down, slowly, tucked up, curled up in the warm, comfy armchair, snug and reading the little book that I had, grasping that, staring up at the dark window sometimes, and then a rat-tat-tat, someone had knocked, tapping at the window, startling me from the book and the glowing, simmering embers of the fireplace too, staring over. I've been alarmed, shocken, thinking Evelyn has come back and returned to me. Startled. Perhaps it had gotten too much for her. Perhaps something had spooked her. Some animal scuttling here and there. Something. Or perhaps the candle had gone out, snuffed out at some point. Or perhaps she'd just found it too uncomfortable, with all the glass debris shattered on the floor, the fragments of all the broken bits of machinery that were haphazardly collapsed in different places. Perhaps it was all the dust and debris that fallen in from the crumbling walls, that it was so smelly and dank and dungy, and with all the dirty mould that had grown there. Perhaps it was just the awkwardness of finding a nice kind of flat space that was clean to sleep in. Or perhaps something had pushed her to come back to the room, back to the cottage to see me again. Still, I was kind of half expecting that she might go back. I wondered if she might return to us in the cottage, that it might get too much out there for her. I wasn't sure, but I thought after an hour or so of seeing the candle out her, of seeing it remained out there for some time, yes, I felt reassured she would stay out there. But no, I realised Evelyn had returned. I felt almost excited, happy that she had in some ways, though I was startled by her to begin with, dashing over then to the door, expecting to greet her there. Instead, though, when I opened the door, I got a shock, as there was a man stood there. I could half make out, though it took my eyes some time, seeing what could only be a broad, firm, bulky build of a man, much larger build, a very brown-haired, scruffy man, with a tangled beard under his chin, that studiously, seriously looked me over. And I was shocked, taking a step back at the door, startled, stunned to see Evelyn had changed, transformed into a dirty, scruffy, older man, suddenly. "All right," the man had sculled back to me, gnarling a little, looking at me with a slight grimace, though it was hard to read his face, looking me up and down. "What do you want?" I'd asked, abruptly, looking back to him, a couple of steps between us. The cheek of it! Who was he? A stranger? At the door? In the middle of the night? I couldn't believe it. I staggered back a little, but then got closer back to the door, pushing it shut a little, closing the gap between us a little. I could have asked him what he was doing. Breaking an entry, trespassing private property. What was he doing here? But I didn't want to then provoke him into any kind of hostility, unsure who he was or what purpose or business he might have here. He looked seriously edgy and a little flustered, perhaps, fidgeting a little. "Well, what's wrong? Who are you, sorry?" I stumbled with the words again, when he seemed to be searching for an answer himself. "I live in next door," finally began the older man, a little gruffly again, slurring with his words, beginning as he began his tale. "Oh, great," finally he said, when I said to him, "I live here. This is my house." "Who are you?" the older man had said. "Well, I live here. I'm the resident. But who are you? "I'm travelling here," the man had said, a little drunkenly, I thought, after some time. You live here," he finally had said. I nodded my head, wondering whether to slam the door, but pushing myself on, wanting to know what the situation was. "Yeah, I live here," I reconfirmed. "What are you doing here? Who are you?" I repeated, looking at him alluringly, but he grinned back strangely, wiping a muddy palm down his robes. I stared at him, a little alarmed still, then carried on, ignoring his strange way. "What are you doing here?" I repeated a third time. "I met a girl," he had finally said, "last night." I finally had said this, but I didn't know what to say then. "I met a girl. She was upset. And I just wondered if she's okay. Is she anything to do with you?" I finally had asked, and he nodded. I wondered if he did know Evelyn, but what was his relationship to her? Yeah, yeah, he finally had yelled back. "You met Evelyn," he finally said.